Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. It's a fabulous winter afternoon to be indoors together sharing Butterfield family stories. I am so honored that you're here. We've all experienced Christmas this last weekend, and we all have stories. They're good stories. Christmas is sad for some people. You just have to take everyone's story and apply it to what has molded you as a person and the person that you've become. About a year ago, I did Christmas interviews of a few residents to talk about family traditions. And of course, with residents who are 70 plus years old, they have a lot of Christmas stories and memories from childhood. And one of my interviewees was our guest speaker today, Ingrid, and her husband, Wolf. Well, their stories were a lot different than the other residents for the main reason they celebrated Christmases as children in Germany. But then they always had to add before the war, during the war, after the war. And that right there defines who they are. But I am so honored to know someone who took those memories and did not become bitter, but molded her life into something that has influenced several generations. I am so thankful that their daughter, Ingrid Polonius, is here. She's in the back, and her husband, Mark Schuyler. Mark is Ingrid's editor. Inez is Ingrid's publicist. And so you don't get too concerned. Ingrid will autograph books after the program. You can purchase a hardback or a paperback. And we'll also make sure you have the information of how to order one of these books online, on Amazon, if you would like to purchase one for a family member or a friend. So without further details, I want to thank Ingrid for being here today, and she's going to talk about her book, Child of War. Please give her a warm Butterfield welcome.
Thank you. I never intended to write a book. Never. And never again. But I belong to a writers group in Connecticut, where we came from. And after a few sessions, every Monday we had to present a piece. So every Monday I was reading from some of the chapters. And I wanted this only to be for my children, that they knew what growing up during World War II was like, nothing else. And after all these sessions in Ridgefield, after a few times they said, Ingrid, this is for a wider audience. Look. Yeah, so that's how it happened. And you mentioned Mark, and Mark needs to be mentioned more than once. Because without him, I would not have ever finished. Never. Because he was the person I could turn to at any moment and say, Mark, is this how you would say it in English? And I was so sure that his presence made it possible. Right here he is hiding. And I'm eternally, eternally grateful to him, because otherwise you would have German sentence structures in the piece and other things you would not know what to do with. So, I am very happy. The other thing is, I had my teacher in high school, my English teacher in high school in Germany. She always gave me the lowest grade for whatever I was reading. And she was saying to me, Ingrid, you cannot write. I wish I would have the chance to show her this. Yeah, so that's all I want to say. To set you up in a way, I was only 3 years old when World War II broke out. And I will read a few pieces. And the first piece is called No Air to Breathe. The baby was dead for hours. The boy had been held high above the heads of those of us crowded into the air raid shelter, while hundreds of us neared suffocation. Whispers of the baby's loss made their way through the poorly dug-out bunker. We stood defenseless, water dripping off the raw rocks onto our heads, pooling at our feet, and soaking through our worn-out shoes. The newborn belonged to our neighbors, the Castellanos, although I was too young at the time to grasp the full impact of the tragedy. The little baby's agonizing slow death grew to haunt me throughout my childhood. Can you all hear me? Beginning in 1940, during the early stages of World War II in Germany, air raids began to threaten us day and night. It was common knowledge that the basement of houses and apartment buildings were unsafe places to find protection. Shelters, therefore, were hewn out of hillsides and hastily built without proper lighting and ventilation. The closest air raid shelter to our home was the one at Ashrod Park, requiring a 25-minute run in order to reach it. I slept with a child's suitcase and my rucksack beside my bed each night. This rucksack was packed with some pieces of clothing, both of whom, and my teddy bear Molly and Waldi, my stuffed animal dachshund, both of them I wanted to survive. Whenever the siren sounded, warning us of an approaching squadron of bombers, we were trained to grab our belongings and run as fast as our little feet could carry us to the shelter. Mom clasping my little brother Hans in her arms. Unbelievably, Nazis, party officials, would elbow us out of the way to get into the safety of the shelter before us, often knocking women and little children off their feet. My mother was struck by their savage lack of concern for us, the civilians who did not count in their estimation. Back home again, she often complained in private about the disrespect we had to tolerate. Having reached the shelter, we noticed that a naked light bulb dangled from the ceiling every 100 feet or so. But with all the destruction around us, no electricity was available because the main power plant was always hit first. Fortunately, some people brought candles in their backpack to the dangerously overcrowded shelter. Candles were among those rare treasures and necessities of war and needed to be used sparingly. However, during that worst night of all my war memories, not even a single match would light because of the lack of oxygen, where hundreds of us were huddled together. During that particular night, in the bomb shelter, there was no air to breathe. No one knows exactly how many civilians, young and old, died that night. Hanging on to life in total darkness for hours, we were completely trapped, nearing suffocation. Mom never panicked. She vigorously secured some space for us close to the raw stone wall of our shelter, pressing our noses as tightly as possible against the dripping, wet rock. I remember immediately feeling some relief when I smelled the freshness of cool earth carried by a little breeze-like movement of air. Even though we could never be certain if this breath of life-saving air was our imagination, my mother made sure that we, unlike so many less fortunate souls, survived that horrible night. The second chapter I want to read, it was very hard, by the way, to make any decisions what to read. It's called The Warning. When visiting Oma and Opa in Allenstein, which is in East Prussia, my mother and we 3 children regularly spent summer vacations in Sopot, a famous seaside resort at the Baltic Sea in the eastern region of Germany. Deep-seated memories well up in me when I try to bring to mind the expansive sand beaches with dunes and pine trees framing the coastline. Not a single rock could be found in the sand. Yet what was highly sought after by those intently searching for a treasure were the yellowish-brown pieces of natural amber buried in the coastal sand and underneath the far-reaching branches of the pine trees. Here, the most rewarding finds were those specimens with once alive insects encased inside the pieces derived from the drops of resin that came down from the pines. These were the highest value and became the centerpiece for a celebrated jewelry industry that exists to this day, selling decorative chains, pendants, and rings with the amber set in precious metal. Here, seemingly far removed from the war, our last visit was during the summer of 1944. Although Mom carefully listened to the official news every day, she was unaware of the potential danger looming over us. In this age of radio news and heavy censorship, only Nazi disinformation about the events in the East reached her. On a Sunday afternoon, after a strenuous journey from the war-ravaged western part of Germany, my father's best friend, Onkel Möller, as we children lovingly called him, unexpectedly appeared at our beach hotel to warn us. Suffering from severe ulcers, he was one of the few men not drafted into the military. My father, however, was conscripted into the army, where he had access to two extremely alarmed, where he was extremely alarmed about the false propaganda circulating among the population in the East. For him, the threat of an approaching Soviet invasion was beyond a doubt. However, the Nazi strategy was to hold back an evacuation from this area as long as possible, potentially risking detection by party officials. Dad hastily sent Onkel Möller to save us. Heeding his warning, we packed up our belongings immediately and boarded the next available train for the 1,000-kilometer journey back home to Kassel, my hometown. Mom, of course, struggled to give up life in this still peaceful place, knowing full well that our return to the West meant going back into the inferno of war. Now, while I am writing my memoir, I am gaining more clarity on some situations and experience that I had never thought about before. Reflecting back, for example, in the political and military circumstances of the time when we were still in the East, shortly before we left Allenstein, creates momentous havoc in my mind. Only in retrospect did I become fully aware of the imminent danger we had lived through when we were still frolicking on the beach at the Baltic Sea during our very last summer there. Also, the fact that my grandparents had only planned a short visit with us in the West for Christmas of that same year makes my heart sink. Engulfed by Hitler's propaganda, they could not have been blamed for trusting that they were still safe. However, I now believe they must have sensed that they were not. As a child, or even in later years, I never heard much talk about this chapter of my family history. The pain must have been just too overwhelming However, I always thought I understood some aspects of the circumstances leading up to this tragic loss. Now that I have taken another close look at the time frame and sequence of the military events that surrounded us then, never before have I so clearly confronted the sheer horror of what might have happened to us. Reflections. At the start of World War II, I was a little more than 3 years old, I said that already, and had only a short time to grow up before the most agonizing phase of the war hit. As far as I remember, we could never find the opportune moment to let the adults who were taking care of us know how we children felt. I can only speculate that the unpredictability of every new day must have exhausted them to the point that no strength was left to pay attention to our emotional well-being. We children had to overcome the ever-present feelings of angst on our own as best we could. Also, I do not remember that complaining or whining about anything ever made a difference. At our young age, we quickly learned that there was nothing anyone could do to change what was happening to us. We youngsters were constantly forced to adjust to disrupted sleep, disrupted playtime, disrupted meals, disrupted plans for the day. But were we unhappy? Did we feel deprived? I honestly do not remember any of those feelings. All we seemed to have internalized was that those round-the-clock disturbances were the normal course of life. We also understood that life was stressful enough for everyone, especially for the adults. So we never wanted to add to their burdens by unpacking our grievances. I'm sure that this was instinctively felt, not consciously understood. What I do remember, though, was being told at certain times that everyone else was going through the same dilemmas, or had it even worse. And that was that. In looking back, I can only marvel at the resilience we must have had at such a young age. I do recall that unquestioning discipline was required from us children at all times. We could never harbor any wants or wishes. No demands were ever appropriate. We certainly did not know what instant gratification might mean. In case we ever felt like complaining, we heard words of warning such as, check yourself, or control yourself. These words of admonishment kept resurfacing in my mind as I grew up. When I try to reconstruct a picture for myself of what life during those years must have been like from an adult's point of view, my imagination goes blank. Even so, I have the suspicion that all of us were aware of the plain fact that we had no other choice than to live like robots in utter emotional shutdown. We were forced into survival mode, and the family members around us had more pressing matters to deal with, such as the extent of the destruction and political oppression in our country. A few remarks from some correspondence my mother received during the war years allude to this. On February 22nd, 1944, a friend responded to a letter my mother had evidently written to her by saying, "Oh yes, you are right. It is better to not think at all anymore." From another letter sent to from our former nanny, I gather that these harsh times brought every citizen close to the brink of despair. Lisbeth lived in the countryside, where towards the final phase of the war, enemy low-level planes engaged in battle with German warplanes, killing those working in the fields and littering the ground with dead pilots from both sides. Most frightening to her was watching the deadly bomber squadrons flying overhead in the direction of my hometown. On February 2nd, 1945, she writes, "In what terrible times do we live? There are no words of solace to be found in witnessing so many losses. The only thing left to do is to muster all our courage, knowing that so many others are going through the same ordeals." These remarks communicate that only a certain stoic approach must have helped everyone make it through the day. The pressures of war forced all of us to put thoughts and feelings aside in order to survive. All that was left for us to do, young and old, was to suppress our emotions and store them deep inside, which is very German. Decades later, whenever the conversation slightly touched on the brutal circumstances of our war-torn lives, only a few meager details were allowed to come to the surface. The pain was so great that these matters were mentioned only in passing, in a kind of resigned manner. In offering their scant tales, my family members always guarded against these displays of emotions. As an adult, I tried at times to engage my mother in such conversations, but she always responded hesitantly to any of the specific points I wanted clarified. She would then swiftly digress to a more superficial subject. Many years later, I once again attempted to elicit answers, hoping that the passage of time, roughly 50 years had passed, would have scarred over some of the wounds of war. Regrettably, it never did. Then, after my mother suffered a stroke at age 87, coherent conversation became impossible. When World War II ended, we children, 11, 9, and 6 years old, must have thought that living under wartime conditions was all there was to life, because we never knew a world without war. The new dawn at war's end not only brought welcome relief for the grown-ups in my family, but also confronted them with myriad new challenges. How could they cope with the traumas of destruction, the family members killed, the loss of my grandparents' quality of life? And their native homeland. With too many tasks at hand, we had little time for mourning. Soon after returning home from the front, Dad was swept away to an American open-air prison camp in Darmstadt, not too far away from my hometown Kassel. In general, military personnel were subject to this fate because they had to wait for the process of denazification to begin. In the overcrowded camp, inmates lived in military tents until they were cleared to return home for good. From letters sent to my mother, I know he was there for close to 8 months. Many years later, when I began to learn English in 5th grade, he often referred to his time in Darmstadt as his opportunity to learn English from the Americans. Otherwise, he never volunteered any information about his war experiences as a member of the military, with assignments to Russia, Lithuania, Latvia, and France. Neither did we children overhear any conversation among the adults in the household about the humiliation he must have endured as an inmate in the American prison camp. I can only assume that, like so many others, he just wanted to forget the past and go on with life. The many field post letters he wrote to my mother during that time had to be written exclusively in block letters. You know what I mean? And no personal thoughts, let alone any complaints, were allowed to be expressed. Looking back, I try to recall what my parents had let me know about their own reflections and even self-judgments related to the difficult years they had to live through. I rarely was satisfied with what I was told, because most often they shared only bits and pieces of stories about family life. When it came to their own assessment of what had happened to us and our country, they fell silent. I simply had to accept that the harm inflicted by their many losses had just been too deep for them to put into words. Consequently, I am now resigned to the fact that during the post-war years, this generation of wounded souls lived with the only coping mechanism they knew, which was silence. However, I can say with confidence that my family relied on drawing strength from a deep conviction that despite our helplessness, angels were watching over us. No matter how spiritual that thought seems, it was a last resort in order to survive while our country was blasted into rubble. I'm convinced that my family's strong faith prevented any severe emotional meltdowns. For us children in particular, it was the strength and resilience of my mother, who against all odds provided an illusory safety net. In reality, though, any moment throughout the war. Could have been our last. Were we, the civilian population, truly responsible for bringing all the war and ruin onto ourselves? I have to answer as truthfully as I can, even though it is painful for me to say that every adult, including my mother and father, were in a wider sense responsible. In the final analysis, the Nazis' obsessive mind control and intimidation tactics brainwashed the German people to the point of having to go along with the propagandist's total war proclamation. Once begun, there was no way out. The party's restraints and censorship did not allow room for any outward opposition. Ordinary civilians, my family included, who disagreed with the party line, never dared voice dissent or disapproval, or else their fate would have been promptly sealed in one of the feared concentration camps. To speak out was essentially to commit suicide. Reflections. Are you still with it? At the start of World War II, I was little more than 3 years old, you heard that. And I had only a short time to grow up before the most agonizing phase of the war hit. As far as I remember, we could never find the opportune moment to let the adults. I read that, right? Did I? Yeah. Okay, I get confused here, which is easy. Another chapter. The Americans are coming. Have you ever had not one, but two machine guns pointed at you? This was my predicament at the age of 8, when I saw when I saw an American face to face for the very first time in my life. We experienced the war's final days in the farm village of Vierbach, when the long-awaited end of the conflict freed us from the war angst. I distinctly remember that it had rained all night. The following morning, the atmosphere seemed highly charged with tension. Were we in immediate danger again? Nobody was prepared to answer that question, despite the unmistakable sound of gunfire that was drawing closer and closer. Then news spread from house to house, bursting like a detonating bomb. The Americans are coming. Strikingly, this moment signaled that the war was over. No one was allowed to leave the house or to be in the streets. A white bed sheet was hastily hung from one of the upper windows as our sign of surrender. In sheer panic, everybody ran to the basement when tanks, with their typical roar of clanging metal, began to roll through the village, leaving thick marks of splashed mud on every house front. The Nazi propaganda machine had left us unprepared for this event, and we feared this would be the fatal blow. We had been praying one rosary after another when the groaning basement door of Boulet's farmhouse, where we were fearfully huddled together, suddenly swung wide open. No one moved. Only dead silence filled the space. 2 American soldiers appeared, pointing loaded machine guns at us. With watchful eyes, and probably as frightened as we were, they tried to assess the situation. Once they noticed only defenseless civilians, including children, they visibly relaxed. Unable to comprehend what was going on around me, I clearly remember to this very day focusing on some ridiculously trivial details at that moment. For the very first time in my life, I was looking at a human being with a skin color different from my own. Only from picture books and the story about one of the 3 kings coming to baby Jesus did I know that people with such a dark skin existed in a distant land. I think he must have felt me staring at him. This soldier had quite obviously been eating from a camouflage-colored container the size of a tuna can, before the two soldiers had kicked in the basement door. My gaze became more pronounced. He had something to eat there. We children were watching the scene with hungry eyes. Immediately, the intense expression on the soldier's face changed. With a trace of compassion, he looked at us and handed the open can with a wooden spoon sticking out to one of us children. The news that the war was over obviously did not draw our attention as much as the soldier's half-eaten field ration. I remember that this little can felt like holding a trophy of priceless value. A second later, so it seemed, we were alone again, disoriented by what had just happened. Eager to get at least one chew from the can, we three children were in no uncertain terms stopped by my mother. She snatched this treasure from us. Then, fearing harmful germs, she cooked and cooked that little portion to death on the wood stove in our room before we were allowed to sample it. Never before had I tasted pineapple sauce or seen an American, either black or white. The following grayish day must have prevented any public outburst of relief. Not even the most timid trace of celebration was noticeable in the street. The war had ended. Could anyone grasp that news? Yet this was the most somber day. The civilian population around us seemed plainly exhausted. To us, it looked as if people everywhere were trying to find their way through a dense haze, shell-shocked and incapable of doing anything more than just going about their everyday business. 31 years later, America became my adopted home country. No crystal ball could have predicted such a turn of events after my first encounter with America at the very end of World War II. Should I do more? No.
It's up to you. Do you want one more? Please. Please, one more.
One more. Saying my piece. This was not my title. But my dear editor, Mark, where is he? He coined that for me. Saying my piece. The hardest challenge for every family was when, in preparation of Hitler's war, the father of the household was ordered to enlist and leave for military service. On August 26, 1939, this life-changing directive reached my family. From draft day forward, My mother was the one who had to shoulder the full responsibility of caring for us 3 small children from 9 months to almost 6 years old. At that time, it would have been easy for her to give in to helplessness and to feel engulfed by loneliness and angst. What added to the hardship was that news, let alone reliable news, about the difficulties my father was living through while being stationed on both Western and Eastern fronts arrived more and more infrequently. As the threat of war came closer and closer to our doorstep, Mom must have felt overwhelmed. Nevertheless, she seemed to gather her strength from some hidden reserve within herself. Her courage and her ability to always make the right decisions brought us children safely through the war. In looking back at the burden she had to carry, I see her as a person of deep faith who trusted in God's care and guidance to help her through the most uncertain situations. Late in her life, I wrote her a heartfelt letter that attempted to put in words exactly how grateful I still was for her constancy, courage, and heroism. The words just poured forth. While she was incapacitated by illness, but still clear in her mind, I flew to Germany 4 times a year, staying at least a month each visit. I handed her my 2-page letter while she sat propped up in bed. She became emotional and wept, one of the very few times I ever saw her cry. Then she expressed surprise that I had put my feelings into words and told me that I was the only one of her 3 children who had done so. In German, we have the expression, "I will stick this behind my mirror," which means it's memorable, it's something memorable and will be saved and cherished forever. In my attempt to strike a balance between the good and the bad in the pages of my memoir, I have to say that in spite of all the loss and pain, we were most grateful for the positives that were left. Our father returned to us. We children were never separated from our mother. Our home was damaged, but not bombed out. We were never forced to flee from the Russian invasion that finally took over East Germany. Most importantly, we all had survived. Fear was the unwanted and inescapable companion in our lives throughout the war. The earliest step in our recovery must have been relearning to sleep through the night without having to jump at the first siren from the alarm system on the roof. One thing is certain, we children could not have recovered as well as we did without having the security provided by the loving members of our wider families. By sharing our living space, both with my grandparents and my aunt and her 2 children, we never felt alone. The end of the war reached us while we were living as evacuees in the countryside. When the day finally arrived and we managed to come home to our familiar living quarters, I was too exhausted to feel the joy and gravity of the moment. In needing to fall back on my imagination, I felt like coming back up for air after being suffocated by the darkness of 6 years of war. This is what peace must feel like as we were greeted by the bliss of calm nights, even in the city. My mother, in spite of having to sort out her own traumas, and without the support of any psychological services, wanted us children to find out our way back to a normal life as soon as possible. She made sure, at least in my case, to find an outlet where I was able to feel safe and could begin the process of recovery. This came to pass when she signed me up for activities in a local sports club. Here I made new friends, found new channels to test my talents, thereby unloading the heaviness of the past. I am absolutely certain that this new endeavor in the field of gymnastics helped me to overcome the worst wartime experiences and strengthened me in my recovery. Not too long ago, when I was finishing up this work, I stood at the edge of a rapidly flowing river. In the distance, the current seemed smooth and calm. However, as the current rushed by, the water was obviously passing over stony ground, tossing up wild ripples in its wake. This turbulence continued for quite some time before smoothing out again, just as it started to bend around a curve that I could not see beyond. What a metaphor for me, I had to think. The course of my life was unfolded like this river right in front of me. This river starting smooth, then rapidly becoming tumultuous, and finally becoming tranquil, captivated me because it so perfectly matched my war memories. The first 3 years of my life came before the onset of war, and for some time at the beginning, daily conditions were still bearable. Then the terrible bombings began, striking us nearly every day and night. At that time, we never experienced any smooth stretches. In taking the long view on history, I am an absolute believer in the supposition that the past affects the future. I hope my memoir will serve as a fair warning that what happened in Germany can happen again anywhere in the world. What my family experienced at the time proves the point of how dangerous it is to tamper with the truth and poison people's perception with mind-twisting disinformation. This poison can take hold of every citizen in this country too. I have received alarming messages from my German family who, from their outsider's point of view, confirmed what they are watching in the daily news about America during the election campaign of 1919 to 2020 reminds them of the political maneuvers that brought Hitler to power in 1933. I will never be sure if the sentiment expressed throughout my memoir can convey the full impact of what needs to be said in order to bring someone else's mind all the nuances of the frightening events that were going on around me. I have constantly grappled to find the most fitting words to put down on paper. However, this has turned out to be a continuous dilemma. In trying to address the full impact of what it was like to be a child of war, I feel my words are insufficient. In the end, though, I have to accept that the unexpressible have no words. My experiences throughout the hot and the cold war thoroughly shaped me, and to this very day still weigh upon me. I strongly agree with the conviction that to make war is the most inhumane way to resolve conflict. And we have that again. Unworthy of human intelligence and purpose. Furthermore, it is self-evident that we earth dwellers have to learn and adopt peaceful ways of coexistence. Otherwise, we will disqualify ourselves as rational human beings. Thank you.
Take a moment. Ingrid will be in the back of the room with her family to offer a book to you and to autograph it. If you have to go, I'm sure we know where she lives. Thank you, Ingrid. Inspirational.
Thank you so much for being here.